So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be looking at what is a difficult passage. This is the passage that comes out of Luke chapter 6, which starts out with Jesus teaching, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. I'll keep reading that in a second. But again, a passage many people fear, and it's a little bit infamous. They're not sure what to do with it. I wanted to share the fun fact that this was the passage that I received for the first time I ever got to do a public sermon when I was just out of college, when I was an intern in a youth group at Big First Presbyterian downtown. And I don't remember if I chose this passage or if I got it, but I looked at it and thought, okay, I want this to make sense for kind of real life. So I should share a story about who I think this might be talking about. And I thought of kind of an experience I'd had a couple years earlier in college, in which Holly and I had a dear friend who just kind of fell apart. She was really struggling with just kind of questions of who she was and her value and who God was. And it was a long, kind of painful process that both Holly and I were involved with, kind of helping her through some of these questions, nursing her back to health. And at kind of the end of this long, painful process, when she was kind of pulled together again in some ways, she started dating this Mormon guy. And this Mormon guy proceeded to tell her that basically everything we had said was wrong, that we'd been out to get her, that we were the ones leading her astray. And I remember this experience kind of culminated in her marrying this guy at a very young age, in which we and our friend's family weren't even allowed in the ceremony. We went to the ceremony, but we had to stand outside because we were not Mormon. We weren't allowed in there. And so I shared this story with the youth group, kind of saying, okay, I'll admit I'm struggling kind of with whether it's Mormonism or this guy and the way things turned out. I'm struggling. Maybe this is the person God is having me think about and talk about as we're looking at this difficult teaching of Jesus. So again, being my first sermon, I shouldn't have been surprised when the next day I get called in with my boss, youth pastor, and one of the more senior pastors, and two very angry parents of a student that were there, and they just started ripping into me like, how dare you teach the youth group to hate Mormons? And I'm like, that's not what I said at all. I was trying to do this, and I was trying to provide, a real example. And no, whether you meant well or not, you're teaching this wrong. And we we're going back and forth on what I was trying to teach and what I think this passage might mean. And at some point in this meeting, they're like, and so said, and I'm like, wait, I'm sorry, who's your kid again? And they told me the name, and I'm like, they weren't there. And they're like, what do you mean they weren't there? And so they called this kid in, and after a little hemming and hawing, this kid admitted that they weren't there. They had, in fact, gone over to the youth group building and skipped, and they and their friends had been down at 7-Eleven smoking cigarettes. And after that revelation, a lot of the steam kind of went out of the room, that they had heard something about what I was saying secondhand. And after that, they kind of left me alone. So it's a kind of a funny story about misunderstanding, but it shows, I think, just a lot of the tension that this passage brings up in people and what it looks like to actually wrestle with it. So let me read this kind of famous, infamous passage out of Luke chapter 6. But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those that curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks. Don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat people in the same way you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. And if you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way children of the Most High act, for He is kind to ungrateful and wicked people. Be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good portion, packed down, firmly shaken, overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion you give will determine the portion you receive in return. So let's talk about how people kind of approach this passage. So first off, I think one of the reasons people get uncomfortable with this passage is we may have heard extreme examples in which this passage was used almost like a weapon. And I've heard the anecdote, I'm not sure if it's true or no, but this was a very popular passage during the transition out of apartheid in South Africa. For instance, those who had been in power, who had been horrible and oppressive and racist in their system and the treatment of people, liked to quote this as power was transitioning out of their hands. You're supposed to love your enemies. Turn the other cheek. Like, you need to now forgive me despite the fact that I did all these horrible things. I've also heard people share that sometimes abusers will say this sort of thing. You need to continue to put up with the physical, emotional abuse I am giving to you because Jesus said so. Turn the other cheek. You need to just kind of let it go. I think pretty much everybody agrees that that's a horrible, awful misuse of what Jesus is trying to teach here. But I think lesser interpretations tend to make people pretty uncomfortable as well. I think people hear passages like this and they fear that if they're taking it too literally, that they will be kind of passively condoning evil and violence in the world. And I've read a lot of kind of complex arguments about what Jesus is trying to do here, that, turning the other cheek would have forced them to, attack again with the back of the hand, which would have been considered shameful. Taking off the coat, would have left someone naked, which would have been kind of a way of shaming someone in the other culture. I think people want this to be effective. They want this to be not as scary as it is. And I think a lot of those arguments, they seem to be begging the question to me, okay, maybe I'm wrong on those. Maybe that is what Jesus intended. But the problem I think people have with this passage so much of the time is it just doesn't seem to work very well in the real world from our perception, right? And so, whether you're trying to kind of go into some convoluted cultural situation, how shame is involved and how it's actually a highly effective way of showing resistance and getting back at people. A lot of people go to the other extreme and say, well, Jesus didn't really mean that. It's an ideal. It's a pretty idea. Wouldn't it be nice if the world worked more like that? And I think that mentality haunts a lot of Jesus's teachings. Like, okay, well, Jesus didn't really mean it. It's a pretty ideal, but Jesus wasn't, down to earth. He wasn't very realistic about it. And I don't agree with that interpretation. I don't think Jesus is coming up with kind of fluff to, kind of inspire people and make a little bit better of a world. Like, not that inspiring people is something to make fun of, but Jesus was a blue-collar guy dealing with dirt poor people, and he seems very interested, often to the chagrin of scholars and the religious types around him, of showing the ways God is actually close and working and how this stuff might apply to real life. So if that is the case and we're trying to avoid kind of those extreme versions and that fear that this just simply does not work, what is it that Jesus is up to in this passage? So I would argue to understand what Jesus is trying to do, we need to back up a little bit and look at overall how Luke writes his gospel. So this passage comes from kind of one of the big blocks of teaching that he has preserved, sometimes called the Sermon on the Plain, I guess, in contrast to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, that started out right with the Beatitudes, right beforehand, right? Blessed are those who, in these very counterintuitive things that Jesus is saying about these are the people who experience God's presence. These are the people who can find wholeness and happiness in a way that should be denied them according to the world. Again, a passage that people tend to write off as very pretty, but not very realistic. But if we look at what Luke is often doing when he starts talking about the kingdom of God, he's got some kind of different interests. I think he, as a Gentile, maybe he, as someone who has experienced a full and rich church in the Holy Spirits, he has a little different and a little more optimistic take than some of the people at the time might have, in which it seemed like Jesus was clearly crazy, right? Luke is a Gentile, an outsider, who is in fact experiencing God's presence in a way that many of Jesus' contemporaries wouldn't have thought was even possible. He's experiencing community lived with some of these kind of crazy out there ideals expressed as actual day-to-day lived communities. And so Luke seems to be a little more open to what God is up to in the world and how crazy it seems than maybe some of Jesus' contemporaries would have even believed is possible. And so as we look at how Luke records Jesus talking about the kingdom of God, we see some kind of big themes. One of those is this kind of this switching, this overturning. We get it all the way back in the beginning in the infancy narratives, right? In Mary's song, in Zechariah's song, about God is kind of doing a great reversal. All the things that the world values, God is turning on their head. He's inviting outsiders in. He's saying the outsiders and the losers of the world get who God is in a way the insiders and the religious and the rich might not, right? One of the things I like about Luke is just how celebratory he recognizes Jesus was, right? Jesus is always partying. Jesus is always at meals. Jesus is telling stories like the prodigal son, in which the lost and the outsider are come and restored to community, right? He sees the kingdom because, again, Luke, the writer, the Gentile, has experienced a lot of this. He sees this day to day in communities and churches, this celebratory fact that God is among us, that meals can be a lot more than just meals, that there is much to celebrate even amongst those that would have been considered, kind of the outsiders, the losers of human history. And Luke is also very sensitive to the fact that Jesus is almost constantly pointing out why is this happening? Why is because that is what God is like. The kingdom of God is the places in which God is expressing his intentions for the world. Most significantly in Jesus' own life, that the big, beautiful, powerful God came to be small and least and poor among a people that nobody was looking for God to be among or to champion, right? And so if this is Luke's just basic understanding of what the kingdom is all about and what God is all about and what experiencing that might be all about, we can hear this passage slightly differently. So again, who is Jesus talking to in this passage? He's not laying out like a moral code in which we're supposed to sit down and look at lawyers and figure out, okay, how are we supposed to handle each sort of situation, right? He's talking about a heart. He's talking to those who have already experienced this, who have a sense of who God is and what the kingdom is actually like, right? So look at this again. This isn't a moral code for the entire world. He says, but to those of you who are willing to hear, one of the ways he often talks about, those of you who are in, those of you who get it, those of you who are willing to know what God is like. And again, he says at the end of this section, then you'll be acting like children of the Most High. You will be God's children. Your identity is one in which you get what God is about and what God is up to in the world. And that's exactly the point. So why would we even consider looking at or doing something that sounds this crazy? Because Jesus is teaching to people who know who God is and have experienced the kingdom already. A lot of people think Jesus is playing with a very specific kind of cultural image at this time, and this was the idea of a patron. Back in the day, one of the kind of highest ways you could have kind of social rank and social status was by being rich enough to give away gifts to artists, to the poor, whatever, to show that you don't need anything back in return. Again, most kind of relationships at the time are very kind of commodified. It's I give you this, you give me that. And so those who are the upper crust, those who we all want to be like, are the patrons. They are the ones who can give without expecting anything back in return, right? This is the cream of the crop. This is the goal. Everyone wants to be one of these people. I don't even need anything back. And it gave them this great social status that we still sort of get with philanthropy and those sorts of things, but we just don't really have a way of looking up to those who had arrived and could give without needing anything back, right? The patron. And one of the amazing things is if that's the image Jesus is teaching from, who is he talking to and saying, no, in fact, you are the patrons. You are those who have something to give back to the world, not needing to receive anything back. You have so many riches in God's kingdom, in your experiences of God, you're understanding the way the world actually works. You can give gifts back expecting nothing in return, not expecting results, right? That fear people have with this passage. I don't think it's going to work in the real world. Those who are the children of God, those who have truly experienced the kingdom and what God is up to in the world, don't need results in the world's terms because God is beyond those things. Again, these are people who know who God is and recognize that God not only was willing not to just say these things. Jesus is not saying this vaguely to inspire a different way of being in the world. He lived these things. He did turn the other cheek. He did experience a gift not being received into the world, and the world pretty viciously stabbing back. I think we need to recognize that is often the response of the world when we are giving the gifts of God's kingdom and those things. So again, Jesus is not asking anything that he's not willing to do himself, just as God came as Jesus, just as Jesus would experience on the cross and in a life of misunderstanding and all these things. He says these things because he's willing to do them in of themselves because he sees that they are valuable. And at the same time, he is also willing to empower, right? I don't think a passage like this is possible without the strength that God is offering. And I think if we're really going to understand what Jesus is doing here, we're not like going through this section with a fine-tooth comb, right? Trying to nitpick and say, what does it look like? How do we actually apply these things? You have to remember, Jesus is teaching this, again, in a public setting. People are hearing this. They're not having it written down and looking for it. And I'm not saying that there isn't value in having it written down, but I think if you just listen to it and it's just boom, 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 thing after thing, right? He's telling us what experiencing the kingdom of God is like. These are the kinds of things we can offer back, a very different way of being in the world when we have experienced who God is and what God is up to in the world. It's going to look like this kind of stuff. And so I think just kind of hearing that and feeling overwhelmed by it and hearing all the pieces and the just possible ways that this could maybe be expressed are kind of the point, rather than just hearing this incredible list of do's and don'ts. I mean, how many do's and don'ts are there in this section if that's what we're after? But then how are those also all potential expressions of a heart that has experienced God and that is continuing to experience God and his kingdom that is there? I think it's just kind of a different angle, a different way of looking at it. So I would argue this is not kind of idealistic gas, to quote C.S. Lewis, that this is not just some pretty thing that God put out there. I also don't think that this is like just this kind of grim, like, well, it seems impossible, but Jesus said we should do it, so, grit your teeth and try harder. I don't see either of these here. This kingdom-y type stuff, Jesus is inviting us to redefine kind of how relationships work in the world and how conflict works in the world. Our natural response is always, something happens to us, we respond right back. Then they respond right back and they respond right back. It breaks this cycle that seems so natural to the world around us. I think it also frees us from our actions needing a specific response from people, right? We often will go in trying to figure out how can I best get the response I want to. And again, I think Jesus in the kingdom is offering us, this is something good, this is something beautiful, this is a different way of being in the world. And the fact that people receive it rightly or wrongly or even viciously does not negate the fact that we can give, because of the riches that we have received in God and the riches we will continue to receive, right? I think we do not need to be always just thinking, what is the response? Is it going to get the results I want? There's a freedom there that Jesus is inviting us into. And I think just, this entire passage, that kind of lurking idea is, well, this just doesn't work in the real world. And Jesus' response, I think, to that most of the time is, what you are calling the real world is something that is in fact fading away. That is not the real world. Jesus does not seem to buy that this is just the way things are and we have to make these compromises and this is just what it is. Jesus offers, I think, the empowerment and the strength to say there's another world out there, there's another kingdom, and watch what God is capable of doing in those places. And I love, after all these things that feel kind of crazy, that feel kind of overwhelming, he says this kind of simple statement, again, relying on God, not our own strength in these things. Give, and it'll be given to you. A good portion, packed down, firmly shaken, overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion you give will determine the portion you receive in return. And so again, the promise here is, while this stuff might feel crazy, if we know who God is, if we know what his kingdom is all about, maybe we can do things that seem like they're going to be crazy and be shocked when we discover the real world is not this kind of grim tit-for-tat thing that we're so often told it is, but one in which God can abundantly provide for us the gifts to give to a world which may or may not receive them. When we can figure out kind of what our own version of some of these things are, in which God is doing a new thing of which we are invited to be part, often in the face of a world that just can't even dream what God is up to. That's what we give. That's the invitation here.